Good evening. The clock has struck 13 p.m., the time when darkness engulfs every corner, when shadows grow thicker and dark secrets begin to unravel. In this segment, we delve into forgotten tales, stories buried beneath the dust of time. Are you ready to listen to the whispers from the other side? This is Story 13 p.m., where nightmares become reality, and reality is more terrifying than your darkest dreams. That night, the rain poured down relentlessly, drumming on the roof of Sari's car like the impatient tapping of fingers on a table. The world outside was shrouded in a misty veil, making the headlights of her car seem like dim, ghostly eyes cutting through the darkness. She sat there for a moment longer, gripping the steering wheel tightly, as she stared at the house at the end of the road. The old family house loomed at the edge of the thick woods, its silhouette barely visible in the downpour. Tall, ancient trees surrounded it like sentinels, their branches swaying ominously in the wind. The house was much larger than she remembered, or perhaps it was just the oppressive atmosphere that made it seem that way. Its roof, once a comforting sight, now seemed to curve downward like a frown. The windows, dark and uninviting, looked like empty eye sockets staring out into the abyss, holding secrets that were never meant to see the light of day. Sari took a deep breath, bracing herself for the task ahead. The house had been in her family for generations, a place of laughter and warmth during her childhood. But now, it was just an empty shell, a monument to the past. Her mother had died only a few weeks ago, and the weight of the responsibility now fell on her shoulders. She was the only one left to sort through the remnants of a life that had once been. As she stepped out of the car, the cold night air wrapped around her like icy fingers, cutting through the thick coat she wore. She hesitated, staring at the house, every instinct screaming at her to leave, to turn around and never look back. But she couldn't. With a heavy heart, she trudged through the rain-soaked path, the gravel crunching under her feet, each step feeling like a march toward her inevitable fate. The front door creaked open with a sound that echoed through the empty halls, a ghostly wail that seemed to come from the very bones of the house. Inside, the air was thick with a damp, musty smell, like a forgotten tomb sealed off for centuries. Sari fumbled for the light switch, her fingers trembling slightly. When she finally found it and flicked it on, the old chandelier sputtered to life, casting a dim, flickering light that barely pushed back the shadows lurking in every corner. The house was exactly as she remembered it, yet completely different. The long hallway stretched out before her, lined with furniture covered in dust-covered sheets. It was as if the house had been frozen in time, preserved in a state of decay. She could almost hear the echoes of her childhood laughter, the distant sound of her mother's voice calling her in for dinner. But those memories were distant, hazy like the fog outside, and the warmth they once brought was now replaced by a cold emptiness. As she walked down the hallway, the floorboards creaked under her weight, the sound amplified in the silence. Her eyes scanned the walls, lingering on the old paintings that hung there. Once vibrant and full of life, they now appeared faded, the faces of her ancestors staring back at her with hollow, accusing eyes. It was as if they knew something she didn't, something terrible that had been buried with them. She reached the end of the hallway and stopped in front of a door that seemed different from the others. It was older, more worn, and covered in scratches that looked like they had been made in a fit of desperation. Her heart skipped a beat as memories from her childhood came rushing back. Her mother's stern warnings to stay away from the basement. She had always obeyed, never questioning why. But now, standing before the door, she couldn't help but wonder what her mother had been so afraid of. With a trembling hand, she reached into her pocket and pulled out an old, rusty key she had found among her mother's belongings. The key was cold and heavy in her hand, its jagged edges rough against her skin. She hesitated, her mind racing with doubts. But the need to know, to uncover the truth that had been hidden for so long, was too strong to ignore. Slowly, she inserted the key into the lock and turned it. The door groaned in protest, as if it had been locked for years, sealing away whatever was inside. When it finally swung open, a cold gust of air rushed out, carrying with it the scent of damp earth and decay. The darkness beyond was impenetrable, a void that seemed to swallow the light from her candle. Steeling herself, Sari took a cautious step forward, her foot landing on the first step of the old wooden staircase. The stairs creaked and groaned under her weight, as if they were protesting her intrusion. She paused, listening intently for any sound that might indicate she wasn't alone. But there was only silence, thick and suffocating, broken only by the sound of her own ragged breathing. With each step down, the darkness seemed to grow thicker, pressing in on her from all sides. The air was heavy, laden with the scent of mold and rot. It was as if the basement had been cut off from the world above, left to fester and decay in isolation. Her candle flickered, casting long, dancing shadows on the stone walls, making them appear alive, shifting and writhing as if something was lurking just out of sight. When she reached the bottom of the stairs, she found herself in a large, cavernous room that stretched out far beyond the reach of her candle's light. The walls were made of rough-hewn stone, cold and damp to the touch, and the ceiling was low, adding to the feeling of being trapped, buried alive. The silence down here was different, deeper, more oppressive. It felt like the walls themselves were closing in, watching her every move. In the far corner of the room, something caught her eye. A small table, barely visible in the dim light, stood against the wall. On it lay a few objects, covered in a thick layer of dust and cobwebs. She hesitated, her heart pounding in her chest, before slowly making her way over to the table. As she lifted the dusty cloth, she revealed a collection of strange and unsettling items. A set of black candles, melted down to almost nothing, as if they had been burned continuously for hours on end. An old, tattered book with pages that were yellowed and brittle, the writing inside faded and almost unreadable. And in the center of it all, a small wooden box, intricately carved but tightly locked. The box seemed to draw her in, its presence unnerving, like it held something that should never be opened. Her hands shook as she reached for the box, her fingers brushing against the cold, smooth wood. It was heavier than it looked, its weight adding to the feeling of dread that had settled in the pit of her stomach. She turned it over in her hands, searching for a way to open it, but there was no key, no obvious lock. Frustration and fear mingled in her chest, creating a tight knot that made it hard to breathe. Suddenly, a sound broke through the silence, a soft, almost imperceptible noise, like the distant echo of a breath. Sari froze, her heart skipping a beat as she strained to listen. The sound came again, closer this time, a slow, deliberate exhale that sent a shiver down her spine. She turned her head slowly, her candle casting its weak light into the darkest corner of the room. What she saw made her blood run cold. A shadow, tall and impossibly thin, stood motionless in the corner, its form barely distinguishable from the darkness around it. It had no discernible features, just a vague, humanoid shape with eyes that seemed to glow with a dim, unnatural light. It watched her, unmoving, like a predator stalking its prey, waiting for the right moment to strike. Sari's breath caught in her throat. Fear rooted her to the spot, her muscles tensing as if they were made of stone. She wanted to run, to flee from the horror that stood before her, but her body refused to obey. The shadow began to move, slowly at first, its steps almost silent on the cold stone floor. Each movement was deliberate, filled with a malevolent intent that made the air around Sari grow colder with every passing second. The shadow stopped just inches from her, towering over her like a specter of death. Its face, if it could be called that, was a void, a featureless mask that seemed to shift and change with the flickering light of the candle. It leaned forward, its presence overwhelming, as if it were examining the box in her hands. Sari's hands trembled violently, the box slipping from her grasp and clattering to the floor. The sound echoed in the stillness, and for a brief moment, the shadow seemed to hesitate, its gaze lingering on the box. Taking advantage of the moment, Sari forced herself to move, backing away slowly, her eyes never leaving the shadow. But instead of retreating, the shadow advanced, its movements growing more aggressive, more purposeful. Panic surged through Sari's veins, adrenaline pumping as she turned and bolted for the stairs. Her feet pounded against the stone floor, the sound reverberating through the basement like a frantic heartbeat. The shadow was close behind, its presence like a cold wind at her back, pushing her forward. She reached the stairs and scrambled up them, her hands gripping the banister for support. The door at the top seemed so far away, but she knew she had to reach it. She had to get out. The shadow was closing in, its guttural, raspy breaths filling the narrow space, and with each step, the air grew colder, until it felt like she was breathing in shards of ice. Finally, she reached the top of the stairs and threw herself at the door, yanking it open with all her strength. She stumbled through, slamming the door shut behind her with a loud bang. For a moment, she stood there, gasping for breath, her heart pounding in her chest as she listened for any sound from the other side. The house was silent once more, but it was a silence filled with tension, with the knowledge that something unspeakable was still down there, waiting. Sari's hands shook as she turned the key in the lock, securing the door. But even as she did, a cold dread settled over her, a certainty that the door wouldn't hold for long. As she stood there, trying to calm her racing heart, a new sound reached her ears, a soft, insistent knocking from behind the door. And then, a voice, barely more than a whisper, calling her name. Sari, Sari. She backed away from the door, her eyes wide with terror. The voice was familiar, yet wrong, distorted like it was coming from the bottom of a well. The knocking grew louder, more frantic, as if something was trying to force its way out. Sari knew she had to leave, to run as far away from this house as possible. But the voice, that haunting, twisted voice, kept calling her back, pulling her toward the door. Her hands trembled violently as she reached for the handle, compelled by a force she couldn't resist. Just as her fingers brushed the cold metal, the door burst open with a force that knocked her off her feet. The shadow emerged, no longer a vague figure but a fully formed entity, its eyes glowing with a malevolent fire. It moved toward her with a speed that defied logic, its mouth opening wide in a silent scream. Sari tried to crawl away, her mind consumed by terror, but the shadow was upon her in an instant, its cold, bony fingers wrapping around her throat. The world began to spin, darkness closing in as she felt herself being dragged back into the basement, into the void. The last thing she heard was the sound of the door slamming shut, sealing her fate.